I sometimes dream about. I was like, could we have AI tools that would help human hiring managers sort of analyze in-person interviews or interviews on Zoom, and tell them, hey, this is kind of a biased question. Like, you really shouldn't be asking that. Or this is you asking one candidate one thing, another candidate the other thing. That's not a good idea. How are you going to compare them, right? Like, help them. But we don't necessarily see those solutions. What we see is like companies automating practices that were kind of problematic in the first place. So
Welcome back to the Data Bytes podcast, everyone. We have an exciting conversation ahead of us and an amazing guest. Hilke Schellmann is an assistant professor of journalism and an AI expert at New York University. In addition, she is the author of The Algorithm, and it's an incredible book exploring algorithmic bias, something that I think is so top of mind for each of us today as AI is just infused in every part of our life. So Hilke, welcome to the Data Bytes podcast. Super happy to have you here.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me and highlighting this super important topic. So thank you.
I'm so curious. You have a background in journalism. When did AI come into the regard of that? I mean, it's a perfect thing to combine the two, but where was that? Okay, now I'm going to add in AI into this mix.
Yeah, it wasn't necessarily a conscious decision. It wasn't like I was walking right into that. I actually, the first time I encountered the book is about AI and algorithms in hiring and surveillance at work. And in November 2017, I was at a conference in Washington, D.C. that was with consumer lawyers, had nothing to do with AI or big data or anything. And I needed a ride from the conference to the train station to take a train back home to New York City. So I called myself a Lyft, sort of a ride share, got into the back seat and just chatted with the driver and asked him, how was your day? And he was like, I kind of had a weird day. No one has ever told me that they had a weird day. So I was like, oh yeah, what happened? He's like, I had a job interview with a robot. I was like, what? A job interview with a robot? I had never heard of that. So it turns out he had applied for a baggage handler position at a local airport, and probably wasn't a robot that called, but he got a phone call with pre-recorded questions asking him about the job, and he just felt like, whoa, this is like a robot. So after that, I sort of made a note, thought about this, went to a couple of conferences, and the theme came up again and again, and I was like, I need to look into this. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of journalistic work here. And who knew? I fell into this rabbit hole, and it's 7 years later, and I'm still working on AI. It has been become, my life's work the past years, and I think for years to come, because I'm still fascinated with the idea, in hiring, it's sort of about the idea of how do we quantify humans? And that is, just a passion and interest that, hasn't let up.
Yeah, so that's so fascinating. I love how you fell into this, because this is why I love taking Ubers and Lyft and all of that. You have some of the most interesting conversation. Who knows, a whole career change from it, right? Unexpected.
Exactly. Who knew? Who knew? You get your story ideas from so many different places, right? And then I started going to these, HR, talent acquisition, psychology conferences, and there was thousands of people. You could tell, half of the panels were about AI and hiring. There were so many vendors, even in 2017, 2018, who had a booth about AI and very basic algorithms at the time. But you could tell this was really pushing into the space. And I kept looking around and I was like, where are all these journalists documenting that this serious change? And it gotten more and more over the years, right? We see more technology and not less, because I think what we see is since the dawn of job platforms like LinkedIn, Monster, and others, that was sort of in the 90s. But what really changed with those is anyone can apply with like one mouse click. So what we've seen since then, and now it's even worse because we have like algorithmic tools and generative AI tools that help job seekers find jobs that can automatically apply. On the other side, big companies are overwhelmed, right? So Google is saying like we get over 3 million applications a year, IBM gets 5 million. We don't have the people to look through all of these resumes and go through all of these applications. So all of, mostly large and mid-sized companies, but now even smaller ones that use LinkedIn and other AI solutions will use these tools to go through all of the applications they get. So it's only going to get bigger and not and not smaller. So I think keeping the tabs on this and like documenting the change, but also looking deeper into these tools and see like, do they actually work? Their promise that this is going to be bias free, finding the most qualified candidates, super efficient hiring, saving lots of money, and sort of to summarize my findings is like, yes, they're very efficient for companies. Companies love using them. They save them a lot of money. But I actually didn't find any evidence that they find the most qualified people. And in fact, I've found evidence that there is bias inside these tools. So some of the marketing language does not hold up.
Do you think that the system, in a way, just as a whole in hiring is somewhat broken, right? We talked about like, okay, yes, it's easier to post a job, it's easier to apply, but now we're like swimming through all this information. Are people already just bypassing it altogether anyways and just getting, personal references and referrals, which we know typically are the way that you like rise to the top and maybe quote unquote cheat the system, right? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I think hiring has always been a cat and mouse game in a way, right? Like it used to be a little different. Like maybe 10 years ago you wanted, or 15 years ago you wanted to stand out. So maybe you send a box of chocolate to the recruiter with your application, or you have like beautiful designed resume. Obviously that you really shouldn't do that anymore because now your resume has to be machine readable. But yeah, I mean, people try to do all kinds of things, cheating the quote unquote, or like winning over the machines, and they use they use internal referrals. There also a lot of people apply, but then actually also contact a recruiter afterwards, right, and send their resume, hoping that a recruiter will take a look. I think in general, hiring is really tough because we do know that human hiring also brings in bias. So there isn't necessarily like this easy way of like, oh, if we would just go back to this, we would have no problems. Like humans are also biased and we bring a lot of bias to the hiring decisions. And I think I would argue we see that in, the last few decades, we've seen women, people of color, people with disabilities underrepresented in the workforce and underrepresented in leadership positions. And I would argue part of that is because of human bias, right? That we have underestimated folks like this and have preferred men and maybe even white men over other folks. So it's not that easy to just go back. But what I thought is like, oh, maybe this is a really good solution because humans are so biased. And when I looked into these tools, I was like, oh, they replicate existing bias, they bring new bias. This isn't just this like amazing new world, unfortunately.
yeah, no, it's such an interesting point, right? Because I think in some instances, there are opportunities where it can help to show us our biases, right? If we take the past data and look at it and say, okay, this is where it's been. But is that practice happening to say, okay, we can now look at all of our hiring practices in an aggregate to kind of analyze and see where we as humans have been biased and say, hey, we don't want to feed that back into the systems? Or are we just kind of moving forward to automate to deal with this over influx of information that is happening to us all?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be great if we would have AI tools like that. But I think the incentive isn't necessarily there for companies to buy that kind of software. I think what is the incentive is for companies to make life more efficient. Like I sometimes dream about, I was like, could we have AI tools that would help human hiring managers sort of analyze in-person interviews or interviews on Zoom and tell them, hey, this is kind of a biased question. Like you really shouldn't be asking that. Or this is, you're asking one candidate one thing, another candidate the other thing. That's not a good idea. How are you going to compare them, right? Like help them. But we don't necessarily see those solutions. What we see is like companies automating practices that were kind of problematic in the first place. So we see them building resume screeners And one way to do that is that sometimes companies give, their AI tools just a stack of basically resumes of people who have been hired here the last few years or who've had like a job interview that is often seen as a mark of success, and feed all those resumes into the system. And what I've seen when I talk to employment lawyers who come in when like maybe vendors and companies talk and want to negotiate, maybe a company will bring in outside counsel. Or what also happens a lot is that companies have used the tool for a while and sort of start thinking like, is this really working? Are we finding the best qualified people? Let's get in someone to evaluate the system from the outside. And what those employment lawyers told me, especially when in resume parsers, what they found is like biased keywords. So for example, one tool had learned that the word Thomas is a signifier of success. So if you had the word Thomas on your resume, probably because your name is Thomas, I would assume that comes in, or maybe you live in Thomas Street, I don't know. That is an indicator of success. So obviously, any human hiring manager would know that your first name doesn't qualify you for anything. But a machine learning tool would not know that, right? A machine learning tool just takes all the data and looks for quantitative patterns, statistical patterns. So maybe this was statistically relevant. Maybe in the yes pile, there were a bunch of Thomases. So this became a proxy. They found other keywords like Syria and Canada as proxies as variables of success. So another problem, right? This could be, and legally, this could actually be discrimination based on national origin for people who don't have those words on their resumes, right? They also found another tool used African American as a keyword. Another tool gave people with the word baseball on their resumes more points. And if you had the word softball on your resumes, you got fewer points, which obviously points to gender discrimination, at least in the US context, because women traditionally play softball. So we don't necessarily know who these companies were. I think the lawyers do know that, but everyone had to sign non-disclosure agreements. But what my hypothesis is, like, maybe this is a company that is a tech company who has a gender disparity. Often, traditionally, we see that in a lot of tech companies, right? So you have more men than women. So if you feed their resumes into a tool might learn over time that, yeah, people have the word baseball on their resumes. They are more successful here than people who have the word softball. Obviously, playing baseball or softball has nothing to do with the job. And even actually, if it had something to do with the job, you should probably hire both people who plays baseball and softball and not downgrade somebody else. But like, we really shouldn't be looking at like hobbies, names, locations to see if somebody is qualified for a job. And I think that's sort of the problem that we saw again and again, that people don't build these systems to look at like, what are the skills, what are the capabilities you really need for the job, and let's look only at that. We throw the whole data that we have into the system, and then we see these like biases being replicated again and again. And I think that's where the problem starts. We also see this, for like algorithms that are used for internal promotions. They might look at annual reviews of folks and use that as a benchmark to train the model. And we know from research that like women and people of color, even though they might do the same job and are as successful as a white man, they're being underestimated in these reviews. So like, you have this historical bias that then gets baked into these systems, right? And so I think that's really problematic. And we see this again and again.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those almost even similar to what happens to our social feeds, right? Which we get caught up in this echo chamber, right? So if you've got caught up in an echo chamber of how you've hired, and then now with an algorithm, you do it at scale, there's definitely a lot more. And we can see this now. Yes, we've seen it in hiring practices, but this could start to be applied in other areas. And I'm really curious because one of the other areas that you dive into in your book is AI and what we call like workplace surveillance, right? Which I think is something really interesting and doesn't also get talked about as much as maybe like the hiring side. Any conference I go to, everybody talks about like the Amazon hiring example, right? And what they did with that. But I'm really
Yes, and they had that problem, right? That like the resume screener over time had learned that people who had the word women on their resumes were woman or women on their resume were less successful at Amazon, so they were downgraded. because they have that word on their resume. And I think that sort of really talks about like this problem, right? That like a tool, human hiring, one hiring manager can discriminate against how many people a year? I don't know. How many can they possibly hire, and how many resumes can they possibly go through? And it sucks for those people that are potentially being discriminated. But an algorithmic tool that maybe a large company uses on all millions of incoming applications could discriminate against hundreds of thousands of women or other people, and that would be that could be catastrophic for a lot of people, and it's not fair and it's not okay.
Is there anything individuals can do? I mean, I've heard silly little tricks of like people hiding in words in white in their resumes so that because, the algorithm's still going to be able to pick it up, even though like a human reader wouldn't be able to see it. What do you recommend job seekers do in this instance?
Yeah, it's a tough one because we don't necessarily know how every AI tool is calibrated in each company, right? But there is a little bit of help out there. So we see a couple of tools like JobScan and others where you can upload a job description and you can upload your resume, and it will tell you if the tool is calibrated on keywords, how much overlap do you have with the keywords. So I think we're aiming for like 60, 80, 90% of overlap. And I've now heard from a bunch of people who use these tools who said, oh, I used to have like 30, 40% overlap. Now I have 80, 90% overlap, and I actually get calls back. So don't look for 100% overlap, because then you might get thrown out because the tool might actually assume that you have just copied the job description. So that might be helpful. We also see job seekers using ChatGPT now to generate cover letters, to polish their resumes, maybe write their resumes. I think these are great tools to use. I would always double check because they're prone to hallucinations. They might make up jobs or, positions that you never had. So I wouldn't trust them because you obviously want to be truthful when you apply for a job. But obviously these can be really helpful and save you a lot of time because it is a drudgery to apply, and it's like I want everyone to know it often takes people hundreds of applications, and it's depressing and hard because you send these applications out, you often don't hear anything back. So I think those tools could be really helpful. We now see automatic tools that maybe that some job seekers use that automatically apply for people. The rate that you get interviews is lower than probably often human applying because, they maybe fill out all these questions in the wrong way, but, you didn't do any work to get there. So, and we see now recruiters complaining even more about the deluge of applications. So I think there might also be a reckoning at one point because we often see like now AI against AI, and it's sort of like, what are we really evaluating here? But, that's maybe for a later day, but it seems like the system is under a lot of strain. And it just takes a really long time for folks to get through. And it's not necessarily clear, well, what company, what or not. I think what might also be helpful is to think through, like, what a lot of recruiters do when they look for candidates in their own applicant tracking systems that most companies have. So it's like a glorified spreadsheet now that has AI built in where you look where people are in the pipeline. But they often also look for like, okay, software developer in New York, and then put in some skills, Python. The same is what recruiters are doing also on LinkedIn and other platforms when they try to reach out to people and build like a candidate pool. They do the same thing. So I would really urge people to maybe have a skills section and put all skills in there, like team working, soft skills, hard skills, because that will help you. And like think through, like you can also put in synonyms, because I think what happens sometimes is like if you look for a graphic designer, you might look for like Photoshop as one of the key skills. But some people might put in Adobe Creative Suite. And then there might not, if a tool hasn't learned sort of synonyms or similar skills or tools that people know, you might get an error message. So you might want to put both things on there. LinkedIn is not going to penalize you for more skills. So I think that could be helpful. I think what is a little bit of a nefarious thing that Joe Fuller at Harvard has found, who has surveyed C-suite leadership, and they found that if companies use AI tools, about 90% of leadership says that they do know that the tool rejects well-qualified candidates. So what a lot of job seekers have suspected, we actually now know that leadership knows that too. But I think what's really problematic about half of the AI tools in this survey, they surveyed about 2,200 folks from different companies in different countries, said that their AI tool is rejecting people who have a longer than 6 months job gap. And I think people need to know that because I think, there can be so many reasons why you step away, out of the workforce for 6 months or longer. Any kind of thing that has nothing to do with your qualifications. So imagine you're the most qualified person you get, and you get rejected because you took care of your elderly parents for a year, or you took care of your kid, or you had a difficult pregnancy. Maybe you were sick. Who knows? Any kind of thing can happen to people. So I think it's maybe good to know. And if you were freelancing during that time or doing any other thing, like put that on the resume. A AI tool is probably going to discriminate against you. It's just programmed to look for those dates, right? So if you can fill those in, I think that might be really helpful for you. And I always suggest to people, maybe you don't like your machine readable resume anymore. If you have a in-person interview, you can just bring another resume that you really like that doesn't have the endless skills section and all these other things that maybe is good for a machine. And when you apply on a company's website, and you upload your resume and it's supposed to parse in like your job experience in the right field, if it's not parsing it into the right field, you might want to rework your resume, because that is an indication that other tools, similar tools, will not be able to also parse, your work experience, your education into the right fields. And that can be, that is a basic computer problem, but happens more often than you think.
Fantastic. All of these are great tips. And I think it's just important to remind people that everybody's dealing with this too. So don't get discouraged in this process. We're all trying to figure it out in this aspect. But I want to shift gears a little bit because I was really interested in some of the workplace surveillance that you talked about within your book, which I feel like is a newer topic, but also has become a little bit more important, particularly with the pandemic, right? When we have more of this work from home culture. How did you find that AI is being used to monitor and evaluate employees? And is this something we should really be concerned about as well?
Yes. I think employees should be concerned about that. So what we've seen in the pandemic, right? Like the tools were often already out there, but with the significant move of lots of people now working from home, I think a lot of managers got really worried, like, what are people doing at home? Like, are they actually working? And so, there are a whole lot of different trackers that companies can build into computers, like from every keystroke monitoring, checking screenshots of people. Are you really at your desk? There's like heat monitors. I don't know if they're being sent home to people's houses, but we've seen this used in offices to check if there's actually a body at the desk. You can also check, how often are you online? Like what URLs are you visiting? All kinds of things that companies can build in. And they don't necessarily have to tell their workers. In fact, case law in the United States is kind of on the employer side in this. So whatever happens on a work computer, if it was issued by the employer, generally belongs to the employer, and they can kind of put on any software they kind of want to. So you may not even notice that you're being surveilled. And we know from the New York Times that 8 out of the 10 largest companies in the United States surveil at least part of their workforce. And we know from other, there's a new company that does sort of sentiment analysis of any text people write, and they work with large Fortune 500 companies that probably most people have heard of. So I would say anything you do on a computer that was issued by an employer, I would not assume any privacy, because we also see like any private Slack channels. If that Slack was issued by the employer, it's theirs. Also, if you type on a computer that was issued by the company, even on a different Slack, that can all be traced, right, and tracked. And we now have companies that say they can do sentiment analysis. Like, they can check your Zoom meetings, like who speaks over whom. Are you bullying meetings? There are all kinds of things that can be pulled out of anything you do on company software. And unfortunately for a lot of people who know that they're being surveilled, I talked to somebody called Emily Smith. She's a medical coder. She knew that she was being surveilled, but it was just so stressful that she was like, one time I stepped away and I guess, she went to the bathroom, and then the green light on her active, I guess, went yellow and then red, and she immediately got a call. And so from her supervisor asking, like, what is she doing? And every day they got these logs, how many, who was most productive, who read most medical files, and who was offline the most. And she's like, it's so stressful. And so she ended up like actually setting a timer. So if she like had a snack, she would use 5 minutes of her break and then go to the bathroom. And she's like, I just hope that I could eat and go to the bathroom in these 15 minutes, and it was really stressful. So the tools, also the companies that built the tools, also say that they can find sort of, if you have negative sentiment about the company, and they can send it, these could be signals that they send right to legal, to HR. So they can also be sent over to build a report. We've also seen companies that track, do you put USB sticks? Do you move a lot of files from A to B? That could indicate that you might be at flight risk, that you're moving files onto your personal computer. That could mean that you're interviewing another company. It could mean all of that, or it could mean nothing. But those are all signals. Anything that you do on a computer can be tracked, and these signals can be combined. And even very large companies that supply like sort of everyday software, those things are built in. So, we only see in some other countries, especially in Germany and Austria, who have like work councils, that, they're different than unions. If you have more than 5 employees, you can vote in a work council, and they actually, with leadership, have some sort of rights to co-decide. And one of the things in the law actually says they get to decide on technology tools in the workplace. So that's why we see often in Austria and Germany, a lot of these tools are not being used. They're only used on a Teams basis, because the Work Council have voted against this, that you're not allowed to have productivity rates based on how many minutes you spend on some website or another, because, who knows if that really means you got your work done, right? A lot of this is like, I often think about it like when I look at new technology, okay, you can track this, you can track how many hours I'm online, what websites do I visit, but is that actually good to understand? Is that meaningful to understand how productive I am? So I think, those are good questions to ask. And we see this also in people who are being surveilled. Like, we now see it's called productivity theater, where people have like mouse jigglers that stay on. Now companies are saying that they can find those mouse jigglers. But, then there's another technology, and we see people like in the morning, maybe checking in Slack at 8, like, ready to work. And then they take their dog for a walk or something. And we've now seen in surveys that lots of people spend about an hour a day in this productivity theater, like going to meetings with their bosses just to show their face on Zoom, or going, there's coffee batching, where you just go to the office for a few hours just to show your face and then you leave. And I don't think managers necessarily want their employees to be wasting time on this. Don't they want them to work? But I think sort of that kind of software and that kind of monitoring disincentivizes people to work, and sort of just incentivizes like presenteeism, right? That you're either in the office and you're showing your face and you're super engaged with everyone, or you're on your computer all the time, or you check in with Slack all the time, right? To just show that you're working. But are you really working? Are you really productive? It's a whole different question.
Yeah, keeping a green light on your Slack is very different than, getting things done and getting the right things done. I mean, we haven't even got into the conversation of that, which is like, how do we make sure that we're getting the right things done? Where do you think all this is headed? I mean, do you think this is going to last? Eventually, we have to realize that these games and gimmicks probably aren't getting us the results that we want, right? Because from the employer side, the results we want really are like productivity and meaningful productivity and increase of products and services types of things, right? And on the employee side, we want to have work that's meaningful and show up as our best that works. Doesn't seem like the surveillance is adding to that.
No, it doesn't. And I think there is this like, tension, right? That like we have a lot of CEOs like talk about like, bring yourself to work. And like, we need people who are creative, critical thinkers. And like, that doesn't usually come when like every your key that you hit on your keyboard is being surveyed, that you're starting to be creative. Like you feel like you're in a surveillance machine. So I think there's a lot of tension there. But I also think like, for managers, it's sort of like, I want them to be creative, but I also want them to be working. And how can I make sure that they're working? It's like, wow, this advance is like a new way to do this, right? Like I would argue that maybe working in an office was like sort of a very basic way of surveillance for the last whatever few decades or 100 years or how many decades people have been in the office. Is like, people are there. I assume that they're working, but you never had the manpower or the folks actually looks over somebody's shoulders and actually check what are they doing on the computer. Are they actually working? And we all know about people that we've worked with who've been, online shopping, and who knows what they're doing on their computer. But now we actually have the means to check like every second what you do on your computer. But that might actually not be really meaningful to understand. Like, are you actually bringing in uh, um, the key things that make you successful? So I think it's more important to think about that. Versus looking at the quantitative things, because some salespeople, they might sell best via phone calls, others via emails. Who knows what makes you successful?
Yeah, and at the same time, I know there's just a recent report from Microsoft Workplace surveys that show like back to back to back to back meetings are terrible for you. And even just taking like 10 to 15-minute break, like you're going to show up so much better in that meeting, more creative, more critical, like all the things that we really want. So there's also new research coming out showing too that like we, particularly as knowledge workers, cannot work 8 hours just continually straight, and maybe even like 2 15-minute breaks aren't enough. Maybe it's like 10-minute breaks every hour or so. And so I think that hopefully we'll see some of this research come in and change the way that we work versus just monitor and maintain what that looks like.
Yeah, I hope so. But we see also like, like I talk about some of the people analytics things that we see. We see like flight risk predictors, and they probably work on large teams where you can sort of predict like people who haven't had a raise for a long time and they have been stagnant, or they are maybe gonna leave, but it doesn't work on the individual. Like the tool can actually not, none of these tools can actually predict if Hilke or Sadie are leaving this year. They can just say people in this kind of position have done X. So the problem is like managers, they don't care if if it's like the whole team. They want to know, well, are my highest performers going to leave? Do I need to incentivize them or not? And that kind of doesn't work. So we keep using these tools, and maybe also for like flight risk and other things. I would argue that maybe you need other knowledge outside of work to understand, like, are people having challenges with their health? Are they gonna, do they have to take care of elderly parents? I hope things that I hope no employer has access to put in the algorithms. But so it's like, why are we using this? Like, it's not predictive for the individual, but managers wanted to use for the individual. It could go, and so many things could go wrong. Like if I know someone on my team is at flight risk, like, am I going to put them up for a promotion even though they're worthy for a promotion? Maybe not. Am I going to give them training or a raise? So maybe I give them a raise, and somebody who's really deserving, but who isn't on the flight risk, isn't on the flight risk list. It just feels like, I don't know why we are looking at this, but companies are looking at some of these indicators to understand their workforce better.
For those who are working in this space or, building these algorithms, what recommendations do you have that we can each take to make sure, whether they're in hiring practices or surveillance or however these are used, right? I mean, bias can seep into the work that we do because oftentimes the data is a reflection of people, and we have been very biased in our past and still have many biases. So what can we as practitioners in the space do? And then after that, I'd really love to know, what is we as just individuals who are interacting with these systems? Like, what can we do as just an individual who is accustomed to these?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think for people building these tools, I think they really need to learn from the problems of the past, and really look at these, and I think there are a lot of journalists out there that test these tools and work with academics to test them and sort of learn from this. Like, we've seen, one of the large one-way video interview companies that used to use AI to like check out people's facial expressions and emotions on their faces. Like, there's no science supporting that kind of analysis, so let's not use it. For some reason, what happens is like that particular company stopped using it, but there's like two more companies that propped up that are now using it again. And it's like, no, we already just did that. Like, we did this analysis, just learn from that. So I think that would be one great thing. But I think also I think one of the things that I see is like a lot of companies are venture capital backed. They need to bring a product to market quickly, and there isn't a whole lot of time to do this testing. Does it actually, does your assessment actually check for the skills, the capabilities that you need to looking for? Have you validated that? Or is it just a video game that you're playing? Or does it actually test for whatever skill you need in the workplace? Does it actually test for team working? That's something you need to be doing. Also, you need to check for bias. You need to check more than just women versus men and for ethnicities. You need to look for people with disabilities. You need to look for intersectionality. What is with like Black women versus white men? We don't see a whole lot of that. And I think what we see is like a lot of hiring vendors put out these technical reports, but they only give them to companies that they want to work with to show how this may have been validated and how it was tested for bias. And that needs to be on every company's website, because a couple of them that I was able to look at, I mean, some were tested with like 20 to 29-year-olds. And it's like, oh, and that generalizes now to everyone? Like, no, like everyone knows that. So I think that is another thing. So we need to have best practices in AI, sort of benchmark testing that is very clear. Here's the minimum. And I think that would be helpful for developers. Like, I think they also need to know, they need to work with psychologists and domain experts, because I think what we see a lot is like, data science people come in from this idea, let's take all of the data and use it. And I think they don't understand that, first of all, there's like legal ramifications in hiring. Like, you cannot take my location, those can be indicators of discrimination. Like, you could discriminate based on national origin because you have suddenly that, you take in locations or something like that. So more isn't necessarily better. And you have to be really clear what are you using, what indicators that are really about skills and capabilities and not about who I am, that I'm a woman or a man. You don't want to look at those things, but they can come creeping in if you have this soup of data that you don't know what you're looking at. So I think that's really important. And then I think HR folks or talent acquisitions folks who work with this software day to day need to be a whole lot more skeptical, and like ask questions like, how was this validated? Like, what is the accuracy rate? How did you check for overfitting? What are the bias analysis? And I think probably running pilot programs would be amazing. Like, don't let it loose on like all the folks. Like, do a couple of pilot programs first. I know it's work intensive. And, I think that's sort of where I think a lot of companies, they want to use the software to save money, and they don't want to necessarily hire now a new person who can oversee this tool, right? Like, but I think you have to have like at least some pilot programming and sort of some piloting and sort of understand, like, does the tool actually work as advertised? Because we've now seen so many times where vendors like advertise that, the most qualified candidates, yada, 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 no bias, and there's bias built into a lot of tools, and companies find out, and it's not okay. I think we also need a whole more lot of transparency, and I don't know how to solve that, because obviously vendors don't want to talk about if their tool doesn't work, but companies also don't want to necessarily talk about. I've talked now to so many HR people who are like, oh yeah, we used that tool for a couple of years, and then we uncovered what you were talking about, and then we quietly didn't use it. And I was like, okay, I mean, I'm glad you're not using it anymore. That's good. But why didn't you tell anyone? Because now, the next company will still use the same vendor and the same tool. And, companies are afraid that, when they go public and say like, oh, this happened to us, we used a tool that discriminated against a lot of women, that, there are hundreds of thousands of women who can file a class action lawsuit. And obviously job seekers are none the wiser, right? Like a lot of them I've talked to didn't even know that AI was being used on them. And certainly they don't know exactly what is being used on them. So I think that's also a real change, because we've seen like a few decades ago, like if you were trying to be a firefighter or you wanted to get a promotion, a lot of companies made very clear what you needed to do, right? Maybe as a firefighter, you need to carry 200 pounds from A to B and do X, Y, and Z. So you can train for that, but you can also challenge that. And we've seen people going to court to say like, well, do firefighters really need to carry all this weight, or is this a way to discriminate against women because women in general, can carry less weight, and so they have court cases and things were changing because of that. But now we don't even know that we're being evaluated, and we don't know how we're being evaluated. So it's really hard to challenge these tools. So I think that's one of the things that when I talk about like sort of a system that isn't quite set up to actually sort of work out the kinks itself and find the problems and change them. So I think that's another larger thing we need to work on. But I think HR people can really push into that. Folks who built these tools can really push for that. And I think job seekers, that's a tough one. Because they don't necessarily have a lot of power, right? And I sort of talk about this as forced consumerism. Like when I want a job and somebody is going to send me an email saying, like I get an automated email saying, you have to take this video game assessment in the next 48 hours, otherwise we'll reject your application. Like, am I going to say no? Probably not. I probably want the job, right? So I'm going to say yes, and I'm going to do this. And who knows if I'm being discriminated against or not. So that's really tough. I mean, by law, I think if people have a disability, it might be helpful to think through, could you ask for an accommodation? Companies in the United States absolutely have to honor that and give you an accommodation. I think for other job seekers, it might be helpful to talk about these problems. You can call your lawmakers. I can assure you that there are people who think through this and like are thinking like, okay, what can we do here? I also love to partner with job seekers. And, we do a lot of, I think we need to have very longitudinal testing. I would love to work with like big companies to actually see like, okay, let's do human hiring. Let's do this AI tool and this AI tool and have thousands of people go through the hiring process and see like what were their labels here. Like hire the people where the AI tool says yes or no, and actually check 3 years later, like were they actually successful or not? Like was it truthful what the label said? And so we could actually test these tools, but we're not seeing that.
I think these are great suggestions, and more importantly, just goes to show how much work we still have to do in this area, and not something that any of us should take lightly, whether we're the ones building the algorithms, we're the leaders who are talking about how we're going to use these algorithms, or even just being the consumers of these algorithms. So I highly encourage everyone to go check out the book, The Algorithm, How AI Decides Who Gets Hired, Monitored, Promoted, and Fired, and Why We Need to Fight Back Now. If you enjoyed this conversation, there is way more to dive into the book. We could talk for hours, and I love this subject, but I just want to say this has been fantastic. Highly encourage everyone to go check out the book. And most importantly, thank you for your work in this space. I'm so happy you had that encounter with your Lyft driver 7 years ago and didn't take it lightly and dove into it further and got sucked into the whole rabbit hole of this space, because we definitely need people raising this to the forefront of the conversation, because these algorithms are not going away anytime soon. So thank you.
Yeah. And thank you for bringing this research to folks out there. I think it's really important to talk about this. And I see like a lot of people don't even know how ubiquitous AI has become in hiring, and certainly don't know some of the problems that I found. And I think that's sort of my job as a journalist, like find the evidence how we use these systems right now. And so I'm going to continue that in like hiring and work, wellness, and like maybe also moving into health, because I think that's another high risk area that we see AI applications being used.
Definitely. Well, Hilke, thank you so much again for taking the time to come and chat with us. And a big thank you to our listeners. Remember to stay curious and keep learning, and we will catch you next time on the Data Bites podcast. Bye-bye, everybody. If you are enjoying the conversations you are hearing today, we encourage you to continue to be a part of the conversation. and join a community of like-minded, extraordinary women. With our free community membership, you're stepping into a realm where learning, networking, and growth are at the heart and soul of what we do. Connect with Women in Data's global community and network with our chapters all for free. But why stop there? Upgrade your membership with a special offer for Data Bytes listeners by getting $20 off a pro membership, in which you'll receive access to over 300 classes, leadership training, and exclusive events. If you're interested in mentorship and networking, we've got you. From monthly thought leadership webinars to exclusive networking events and a diverse on-demand mentorship program, the connections you'll make here are boundless. Join us and be part of a vibrant network. Dive into our book clubs, growth groups, and industry-focused gatherings. Women in Data is not just a community. It's a movement, a place where innovators, changemakers, and leaders come together to shape the future. Visit womenindata.org to join or use the special discount code in the show notes. Together, let's drive change one data byte at a time.